Hey Spurs students, it's Dr. Potocek again, and we're back. Today we're going to talk about logos and logical appeals, and this is going to be part one of a two-part video. I think that logical appeals are in some ways the least intuitive and maybe the most challenging of the rhetorical appeals to actually analyze, so I wanted to slow it down and spend some time really focusing in on what it is I mean and what it is rhetoricians mean when we say logos or when we talk about logical appeals. And I want to start by thinking about some of the misconceptions about logical appeals. The first misconception is this idea that logical appeals are somehow better than the other types of appeals. Particularly, many people often say that, oh, it's much better to appeal to someone's intelligence than to their emotions. That's incorrect, actually. All three rhetorical appeals work together, and all three are equally valid. And in fact, no argument is totally devoid of any one of them. Different audiences may appreciate higher levels of a logical appeal or higher levels of an emotional appeal. If you're presenting to the Supreme Court or the National Science Foundation, for instance, you're probably going to downplay your emotional appeals and really play up your ethical appeals and your logical appeals. But the word logical doesn't mean that these appeals are better than any of the other appeals. They're simply another weapon and another type of appeal in that arsenal. This is the other big one. That's Joe Friday to the right, by the way. He was a character in a 50s and 60s TV show called Dragnet, and he was famous for saying just the facts, man. This is a misconception that I see students have time and again, both in the Spurs class and when they reach my class, Rhetoric 306 on campus, which is they think that finding the logical appeals in a persuasive text is simply a matter of looking at the facts and looking at the statistics. And so they'll give me papers where they say, this author doesn't use many statistics, so she isn't being very logical. That's not true, or that's only partially true. That's a misconception about what we mean when we say a logical appeal. Facts and statistics are one type of a logical appeal, or maybe more specifically, they're one part of a logical appeal. We call them inartistic proofs, and we're going to talk more about that here in a minute. But they're only one small part of it. They're only one small type of it. They work within a larger structure. Let's zoom in on that a little bit, because I find that often I have to do a little persuasive reasoning to convince students that facts and statistics aren't sufficient on their own to be logical appeals. So here's 4 facts, and each of these is actually a well-documented fact about climate change. The first one is, this is a quote from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and they say, in short, the historical Atlantic hurricane record does not provide compelling evidence for a substantial greenhouse warming-induced long-term increase. The second fact, the planet's average surface temperature has risen about 1.62 degrees Fahrenheit, 0.9 degrees Celsius, since the late 19th century. And that comes from NASA. The third fact comes from the British Antarctic Survey. Antarctic ice cores show us that the concentration of carbon dioxide was stable over the last millennium until the early 19th century. It then started to rise, and its concentration is now nearly 40% higher than it was before the Industrial Revolution. And the last fact comes from NASA again. In the last 650,000 years, there have been 7 cycles of glacial advance and retreat, with the abrupt end of the last ice age about 7,000 years ago, marking the beginning of the modern climate era. What do those facts have in common? Other than the fact that they are all related to climate change, nothing. The truth is we can't just give people facts, and we can't just show people statistics. Facts and statistics are discontinuous. They're single data points, or they're single groupings of data, and they're messy. And you'll notice that those facts don't agree with one another about how to define climate change, about what's occurring when we say climate change. By themselves, this is really important. Facts and statistics don't tell a story. They don't compose a narrative. They're not persuasive. People, readers, authors select facts, and they use them to support arguments. They become part of a chain of reasoning. but they don't compromise the whole chain of reasoning, the facts themselves. Let's look at two ways that we could combine these facts. The first is to say humans are causing climate change and the scientific record proves it. For instance, ice core data from Antarctica shows a 40% increase in the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution, while the average surface temperature has increased by 1 degree since 1900. There, to create that argument, or that little unit of argumentation, right, I've selected two of those facts, and I've put them together, and I've added a claim, right, that humans are causing climate change. Similarly, I've done the same thing in this second example. Is man-made climate change happening? Evidence suggests we should be skeptical. For instance, NASA points out that the Earth has experienced 7 cycles of serious temperature fluctuations, and the NOAA has even demonstrated that the hurricane record does not show compelling evidence of a greenhouse gas-related increase. You can see that I took two other facts, two other data points, and was able to create a completely opposing counter-narrative, right? And just for the record, I should state that I believe climate change is happening. I'm not trying to suggest with this second example that we should be skeptical of it. I'm simply saying that selecting the way that you select and deploy your facts, which facts you pay attention to and which facts you ignore, are part of how you create a chain of reasoning in a logical argument. And when we talk about rhetorical fallacies, we'll talk about the fallacy of sort of ignoring the broad pattern of facts to focus in on information that doesn't fit in within that, which is part of what I'm doing in that second example. And I'm also playing a little fast and loose with the NASA data, because NASA follows it up by saying that we're now in an 8th period of serious temperature fluctuation, which is much different than the previous ones that the geographic record has pointed out. So just in case you thought that Dr. Potocnik was a climate change denier, I am not, and I just wanted to make that clear. But my point stands that depending on how we deploy facts within a narrative of argumentation, that's a logical appeal, not the fact itself. So, Logos works through claims and proofs. A persuasive argument is a kind of narrative. It organizes different claims, the ideas that it wants its readers to accept, into a coherent structure. It's a narrative that's different from a personal narrative or from the narrative of a novel or a poem, but nonetheless, a persuasive essay has an endpoint, which is to persuade its audience to agree with it, to take some action, or to believe in what it's saying. And it does so by arranging its claims, its different points, into a kind of structure. So the claims are the ideas that it wants its reader to accept. It supports those claims by providing proofs, good reasons and good evidence that an audience is likely to accept. Good reasons are explanations of the claims that answer the question, why? And we'll talk a lot more about those in the second video. Good evidence, which we're focusing on right now, is proof that the ideas and the claims and the arguments are real, not made up. That is, that we can verify them, that they have some relationship to the empirical world in which we're walking around on. This includes what we call inartistic proofs, which are facts and statistics, as well as other forms of proof like expert testimony or eyewitness accounts. So, the structure of a logical argument is a claim, a persuasive idea that it wants you to accept, and a proof, reasoning and evidence that explains why we should accept that idea. This is so important that it gets its own slide. This is the whole unit of reasoning, a claim and a proof and an idea that we'll introduce in the second part of this video. But a claim and a proof, that's the logical appeal. A text is built up of those sequences of logical appeals that dovetail with emotional and ethical appeals. So once and for all, when you turn in your papers to me or to your graders, I don't want you to say, this author uses statistics. She is making a logical appeal. That doesn't work. You need to say, this author uses this particular statistic as a proof to prove that this claim is legitimate. That's an example of how to talk about a logical appeal. So here's an example of claims and proofs. We'll work with that paragraph I wrote earlier. Humans are causing climate change and the scientific record proves it. For instance, ice core data from Antarctica, yada, 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 right? So there are actually two claims here. First, humans are causing climate change. Second, the scientific record proves it. The first proof we're using is ice core data from the British Antarctic Survey. And the second proof is an increase that we're talking about the increase in surface temperature, which has increased by 1 degree Celsius since 1900. To think like a rhetorician, you need to ask yourself, are these proofs sufficient? That is, do they actually address the claims that I'm making persuasively? I'm not going to answer that question, but I want you to think about it, because I want you to think about that whenever you see a unit of argumentation. What's the claim? What's the proof provided? Does it answer that? Is it sufficient? Does it actually speak to what the claim is? So, to wrap up this section, logical appeals are the structure of an argument. They're the formal structure. So arguments with strong logical appeals are internally consistent. They make sense to the reader. Claims don't contradict each other. No extraneous or strange information is included. Arguments with strong logical appeals select appropriate data for their audience, and they explain why contradictory data is wrong as appropriate. That's kind of a new idea here, but the idea is if you're going to argue that climate change isn't happening, you have to come up with a compelling explanation for why all that data is wrong, and for why 93% of scientists, or 97%, I don't remember, a very high percentage of scientists all agree that climate change is happening. If you just ignore all that information, your argument does not have a very strong logical appeal. And you also have to select appropriate data for the audience, which means you have to think about what is the audience likely to accept and what's its level of expertise on something. You can talk to a panel of scientists with much different data than you can talk to a group of fifth graders. But in either case, you'll have a strong logical appeal by selecting the appropriate and credible data for them. Okay, that's all from this video. There's no quiz because hopefully you'll soon watch part 2 of Logos and Logical Appeals, where we're going to introduce some new wrinkles and some new concepts into this idea of what is a logical appeal. Thanks for listening. I'll be back with more soon.